Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CEPS. I'm Cinzia Alcidi. I'm a senior fellow here at CEPS, and I would like to welcome you to this lunchtime meeting. This is a joint event between CEPS and EconPol. EconPol is a network of European universities, think tanks, and research institutes, going from Oxford to Toulouse, from Lisbon to Warsaw, from Trento to Finland, to Helsinki. So it's a very large geographical coverage of research institute, and it basically aims at fostering debate and cross-cooperation among the partners of the network, focusing on fiscal policy and macroeconomic issues in general. So I'm really glad to be here today for this second meeting of this lunch debate series. Maybe before we start, just to say, EconPol annual conference will take place on the 7th and 8th of November here in Brussels. If you're interested in attending, please just check the website of EconPol or just send an email to me. The big topic this year will be trade, but there will be a lot of parallel sessions covering many other different aspects. That said, let's move to the topic of today, which is pension reform in Europe, recent experience and challenges ahead. I have an excellent group of panelists, and today the question is, why are pension reforms so difficult? How can we square the difficulties of reforming pension system with an aging society in Europe, this is really a reality. And in order to answer this question, we will look at many different aspects. And among the speakers, I have Felix Waldschmidt. He's professor at University Carlos III of Madrid. Benjamin Becci is a researcher at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Vienna, IHS. Per Eckfeldt is ad hoc sector at DG ECFIN. His main expertise is public finances, so he's one of the authors of the big reports about aging and sustainability of public finances. And last but not least, Tito Boeri is professor at Bocconi University and is also former president of INPS, the Italian Social Security Administration. So we will have really the opportunity to look into more sort of academic approach and theoretical approach to the issues and into the experience of countries. Without further ado, I leave the floor to Felix, please.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about a very particular aspect of pension reform. So this is from my work together with Pedro here. And that is, we are starting from the observation that the public sector and the private sector, the working decision between the two, is one where you have to, the two sectors are kind of different. And they're different in three types of aspects. So first of all, the public sector pays different wages while you are working in the public sector relative to the private sector. Then people usually talk about what is called a job security premia. That is, when you have a public sector job, it's safer than the private sector job. But finally, and this is what I'm going to focus on today, obviously, there's what we call a pension premia. That is, in many countries in Europe and also in the US, the pension systems are not fully integrated, meaning that people who work in the public sector face different replacement rates and different pension schemes than people who work in the private sector. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Why do we think that's interesting? Well, first of all, there's just a cost aspect to it. Paying higher pensions to your public workers is costly. So we want to get behind that. How costly is it actually? But second of all, there's also maybe a more indirect effect that you haven't thought about so far. And that is, if you make the public sector particularly attractive relatively to the private sector, well, then a lot of people will want to start to work in the public sector rather than in the private sector. Given that the total amount of jobs that the government wants to create is kind of fixed, this leads to something we call job queuing. That is, people, they are all applying for a fixed amount of jobs. leading to a lot of people not searching in the private sector where they should search, but rather in the public sector, and thereby to unemployment. So that's the basic idea. Now, as I already alluded to, it used to be that in a lot of European countries, the pension schemes between the private and the public sector, though both run by the government, were separated. But there were some reforms, particularly since the Great Recession, that tried to harmonize them. So we take data here from the OECD Pension Outlook in 2016, and the game that we are going to play is basically to ask, look, if you would harmonize them fully, what would be the effect on the labor market? What would be the effect on the fiscal side, on revenues coming from taxation and from expenditure going to different programs? This just to give you an idea how large these differences in these different sectors really are. Let's focus on the European countries here. So United Kingdom, for example, average replacement rates of 50% in the private sector, yet in the public sector, it's around 100%. That's in the UK mostly because there's what's called a top-up system. It's not obligatory, but it's so attractive that basically everyone participates, which pays you a higher pension if you work in the public sector. France, 55 to 63% replacement rates. Spain, 81 to 100%. And in Spain, this is actually the country that during the Great Recession fully harmonized the two systems, meaning that everyone who's now in the public sector as I'm screwed, I get the 80% from the private sector. Now, the first thing that we do in this paper is we try to quantify how important or how much do these pension systems, how much is this worth to workers who are currently working? Now, you can already imagine the pension system having a high pension is particularly important for workers who are close to retirement. Why? Because they are pretty sure that they keep their job until retirement, so for them it's important. But second of all, they don't discount the future so heavily as the young people because they're pretty close to retirement. So you would expect for the old people pensions to be particularly important. So what we ask here is, how much would I have to up your wage if I would take away your pension premium? Yeah, to take the example from Spain, let's assume I only pay you an 80% replacement rate instead of the 100% replacement rate. By how much would I have to increase your wage until you retire? And for example, for Spain again, looking at someone who's 60, this would be around 30%. I have to increase the wage for the remaining years that this person is working. Again, for younger people, this is much lower, but in general, you see quite sizable pension premia, taking like a cross-sectional average of workers. This ranges from 6.6% in France to close to 30% in the UK. So these pension premiums are worth a lot to the people who get them. Now, the last thing that we then ask is, look, if I now abolish these pension premia, if I harmonize the two systems, what would be the effect on the labor market? What would be the effects on the fiscal side? And what we find are, first of all, quite sizable labor market effects. These are changes in percentage points of the unemployment rate. In France, this would be only a decrease of the unemployment rate by 0.1 percentage points because less people are looking for these two attractive public sector jobs. But in UK, you get a pretty large effect of more than 1 percentage point. These costs are expressed in euros per yearly euros for a person in society. So reducing these high public sector pensions in the UK would give a benefit to everyone in society of 213 euros by the reduction in the cost of the pension system. It also brings a little bit less revenues in. Why? Because we tax these high pensions, so there's kind of a small feedback effect, but you see that this feedback effect is much smaller than the direct cost effect. So there's a sizable benefit to the government from reducing pension premia, both because it reduces unemployment, but also because it directly reduces costs. Again, it's difficult, particularly because old people love high pensions.
Okay, many thanks. And now is the turn of Benjamin.
So I'm also presenting quite recent research, which I did together with my colleague Berthold Wieger. And we are looking on the political feasibility of increasing the legal retirement age. So population aging due to an increase in life expectancy is a phenomenon that is that we experience in virtually all developed economies, and perhaps sometimes it's worse to say that the trend as such is not alarming, but that's a pleasant problem that we're working on, because in the end we are living longer, which is nothing bad. But the problem that we might have is that we have pressure on old age security. So here's just short figures for the OECD average, where you can see that men had expected years in retirement in 1970 of 10.5 years, and that increased to 18 years in 2016, and similar figures are for women. So also for women, the expected years in retirement increased quite drastically. And that is a point why we should ask, or why politicians are asking, how can we keep the public pension systems stable? And in principle, there are three options what you could do. So you could increase revenue of the pension system by raising contribution rates, taxes, or debt. So you could cut benefits, or you could postpone retirement. And from these three options, the first strategy is probably the strategy that has been mostly used. And given that it's been widely used, it's perhaps a strategy that we can't sustain for quite a long time. So given that social security contributions are high in many countries, taxes on labor are also quite high in many countries. And concerning debt, well, a few years ago, the point was even stronger when we had positive interest rates in a world with negative interest rates. I'm not sure if this point is so strong anymore, but in general, I would say economists would not argue for financing consumption with debt. So although this is not a strategy that seems to be very valid. So the second strategy, cutting benefits, is a strategy that is extremely unpopular. So there is something like loss aversion. So people don't like taking their money away. And the strategy becomes even more unpopular when the population ages. So for politicians, it's harder to cut benefits in an aging population. So what remains is mainly the third strategy. So increasing or postponing the legal retirement age. And what we then did is simply looking at correlations in countries. And what you can see in the first panel here is the population over 65. And in the lowest panel here, you can see changes in the average legal retirement age, so the average between men and women. And what you could see is that if the population juvenates, like in the 1980s in France, we experienced a decrease in the average legal retirement age. The opposite was true, for instance, in Germany and in Austria, where we had a aging population and we had an increase in the legal retirement age. But then this is not a uniform thing, because if you look at Austria, nothing happens in the legal retirement, although the population ages. And then we asked why is this the case? And we looked at another feature of the pension system, and that's the replacement rate. And what you can see then, that if you have divergent trends in the population aging and then the replacement rate, you see going down of the average legal retirement age or going up. So depending on in which directions these effects go. But if you have a co-movement, so if the population ages and the replacement age goes up, you don't see an effect on the average legal retirement. For instance, in Belgium, it's quite similar like in Austria, and you can make this graph for many countries. And that was a picture where we tried to find an economic model and an empirical analysis going beyond this simple correlational graph to explain what is going on here. And so we developed this model, and it's a political economy model, so where we have as an outcome a voting process. So we are voting over the legal retirement age, and what we find is that retirees prefer a higher legal retirement age compared to workers, and that those retirees who have just retired prefer even the highest legal retirement age. And two other features are that an increase in life expectancy leads to a higher legal retirement age, and an increase in the replacement rate leads to a lower legal retirement age. I will explain this in a minute with a graph, and then we also did some empirical tests. So I don't want to bother you with equations from this model, and luckily this model can be shown in just one graph. What you can see here on the x-axis, so down here is the age of the voter, and on the y-axis you can see the prevailing legal retirement age. And this R star here is the legal retirement age that is prevailing so far. And for a person of this age, so of age A, what is the effect on the legal retirement age up to the point where the legal retirement age is today? The two effects are going on. On the one hand, if you would increase the legal retirement age, these people would have a higher pension. So that is a nice thing, so they would increase the legal retirement age. On the other hand, economists argue that there is a disutility of labor, so we don't like to work, and that is what is the negative effect. So in these two effects are balancing out. So the working population, which you can find here, would take the prevailing legal retirement age as it is currently. So what happens once a person goes into retirement? These are the persons here are those that are just retired. So these are the persons that should have the highest incentive to increase the legal retirement age. And in this model, which is quite stylized, they would even go so far to let the people work until they die. So those ones were still in the employment sector. The guy here is the guy who will die tomorrow, so he doesn't really care about the legal retirement age, and he could have preferences all the way. So this dotted area here is preferences that could be somewhere between the prevailing legal retirement age and letting the people working until you die. So now you might ask, is this really a phenomenon, or this is just a model which economists do? And so we brought this idea to data, and what you can see here is microdata from Germany, and this line here at the point 0 is the point where people go into retirement, and the dots here are answer possibilities where people in a survey have been asked, what would you do to reform the public pension system? And the dots are here or marked here give you the answer, I would increase the legal retirement age. And what you can see is that really shortly after going into retirement, this option, let's increase the legal retirement age, really goes up by more than 20 percentage points. So those people who are just retiring are really more in favor to increase the legal retirement age as those who work. Concerning the other two hypotheses, we did some econometric analysis, and I just briefly can show you here that indeed the replacement rate has a negative effect on the legal retirement age due to the point that an increasing generosity in the system makes it less attractive to work longer, and the opposite goes on for aging. So if you age, you might have saved too less for your pension, and you're rather in favor of increasing the legal retirement age. So that's just summed up here. I just go to the policy conclusion because the first 3 points is what I just said. So there are two policy conclusions one could draw perhaps from here. So the first thing is that if you really want to increase the legal retirement age, you also have to think about the generosity of the pension system. So if you decrease that generosity, or at least keep it constant, that makes you perhaps easier to increase the legal retirement age. So if you increase generosity, it makes less possible to increase the legal retirement age. And the second policy conclusion is having a look at who is retiring now, and going to the fact that the baby boomer generation will now retire in many countries. That could be perhaps a window of opportunity to increase the legal retirement age in many countries, as a large share of the electorate, or relatively large share, might change their views on which policy option one should take to reform the pension systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like now to ask Per to present more European kind of perspective on the situation of the pension reforms.
Okay, thank you very much, Cynthia, CEPS and EconPol for inviting me here today to talk about European experiences with pension reform. Okay, so I'll try to give you the broad trends across all of the EU countries, what's been happening in the pension reform area in the last couple of decades. So as you can see from this slide here, there has been a lot of increase in the intensity of pension reform measures, especially since 2010, but also to some extent since around year 2000. The Commission, together with all of the member states, we have been tracking these developments for more than 15 years now, and what we can observe is that all of these reforms have had very strong effects on reducing projected future expenditure of public pensions. The latest projection from last year actually indicate that over the long term, pension as a share of GDP would actually be unchanged. I'll come back to this somehow surprising finding very shortly. One thing that we saw incidentally from a previous graph is that there's been an increase in the length of retirement on average in the OECD area. Here we look at the average exit age from the labor market for the EU 28, so for the full EU bloc, all the way back till 1970. So what has been observed then is a constant reduction in the exit age from the labor market all the way up until around 2000, which is where we found before, where the intensity of pension reforms started to increase quite a bit. And since around 2000, there has been actually been some increase in the effective exit age, partly reflecting reform measures of pensions. One particular type of reform option that has been explored a lot, especially in the last decade or so, is to introduce automatic mechanisms into pension systems. So there, you can divide this into three types of mechanism. One is a bit brutal, perhaps. It's an automatic balancing mechanism. Whenever the system goes into deficit, you adjust indexation, or you adjust some parameter of the pension system. The other two that has become much more popular among policymakers is that you introduce a link between the change in life expectancy and some parameter of the pension system. Many countries introduced a link between the size of the periodic pension benefit and the life expectancy. And more recently, what has been even more popular is to introduce a link between the retirement age and life expectancy as a way to make the systems more robust to changes in demographic structure. As I showed you before, overall in the EU aggregate, there is no change, in fact, projected in pension expenditure as a share of GDP over the very long term. This is not intuitive for many people, given that we are largely aware of population aging effect, that is a much higher proportion of older persons compared with those of working age population. So the explanation of that finding is that the first factor, the pure demographic factor, if that was the only thing that was driving pension expenditure, the increase would not be 0. The increase would be almost 7 percentage points of GDP. So this is simply the size of the change in the proportion of older persons compared with those of working age. There are two key offsetting factors. One has to do with the relative size of the monthly, of the periodic pension benefit, so the generosity of the system. This factor is the green dotted line. It's subtracting 3.3 percentage points overall. So this is because pension is growing, average pension are growing less fast than average wage. So this is the indexation, parameterization reform measures at play. The other factors is the increase in the retirement age. And this is depicted here by the red line. And because by now, almost all countries have increased some type of increase in the retirement age. In some cases already happened, in the majority of cases still to happen in the coming 5, 10, 15, 20 years or so. So the total effect of this is actually a stabilization. There is one condition for all this though. It is that there are no further changes in policy. That's always a challenge for many policy areas. What we've done in our latest sustainability report is that we try to move more to a risk-based approach and not fully relying on so-called central baseline scenarios. In terms of total change in all age-related spending, that comprises pension, but also healthcare and long-term care, and so on, other government spending programs. We find a relatively modest increase of 1.7 percentage points in a central scenario over the long term, over the next 50 years. A couple of upside risks exist that has a direct implication for pension expenditure. One is let's assume that labor productivity growth is a little bit less dynamic than we have assumed in a baseline scenario. This typically leads to much higher pension expenditure, estimated at an additional 0.5 percentage points of GDP over the long term. Another interesting case is we assume that life expectancy would increase by 2 years more than what we have in a baseline. Baseline scenario is typically 1 year life expectancy increase per decade, typically, in most countries. This has an even stronger upward effect on pension expenditure, reflecting the fact that a lot of countries have so-called non-dynamic retirement age, so it stays set at a certain age limit. By far the biggest risk factor we find is not one of underlying assumptions, but it's one of policy risk, and that's a pension reform reversal. This scenario assumes that the legislated increases in the retirement age do not fully materialize, that is, countries revert previous reforms on the one hand, and on the other hand, stricter indexation of pensions. We assume that this will also be lower than in the main scenario. So instead of increasing by 1.7, if there is to some extent reform reversals going on, the increase could be almost triple that, in fact. We also heard before the risks with an aging population. What we can already see here, and this is again for the EU aggregate, the EU 28, was a remarkable stability in the median age of voters ever since 1960 up until early 90s, mid-90s or something. So it remained pretty constant at about 41, 44 respectively for males and females. Currently, we're nearly halfway through the transition to a much higher median age of the population. And based on the latest projections of population projections, it'll stabilize again around 2040. What we can already have seen now in several EU countries, and incidentally tomorrow in a meeting with the Economic Policy Committee, we're going to review 3 countries that have done reform reversals. So we're trying to estimate the quantitative effect of these measures. So that's a constant challenge. We know that older persons have a higher propensity to vote. Older persons might have different priorities for which policies are important. For example, pension policy can be very important if you're close to retirement compared with what the young think. Perhaps also healthcare and provision of long-term care, good quality long-term care and healthcare. So one important challenge I think we find is to redefine what old actually means. So I conclude here with nothing that is not a policy recommendation of any kind. It's a little mathematical experiment simply. So if you consider that a dependency ratio of 30% is fine, is bearable, how do you need to set the old age boundary in the far future given the changes in the population structure? So it would then mean that the new the retirement age would need to increase from the typical value of age of 65 up until 74 in the far future. Actually, a few EU countries have legislation that are along those lines by the far future date of 2070. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Per. This was really, please take a seat. This was really very interesting and a nice complement to the previous presentations. Before I ask Tito to comment, maybe just two observations. So the first paper say that there is still quite a substantial difference between private and public sector. This came to me as quite a surprise. Second paper, individuals are quite selfish. So actually they express their voting preferences very, when it comes to pension reforms, very much depending on where they are. And this is a bit also in line with what you say, depending, I mean, if you're retired, you may be very supportive of extending the retirement age because you're not affected by it. And the third point is a lot of reforms happened actually since 2000. Now I would like to give the floor to Tito to comment on this and also maybe to give us some insight about the process of reform. As you prefer.
All the speakers are going here, so let me do the same. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's really very interesting to have this opportunity to talk and interact with you. I think my role here is to react to what has been said so far, more than presenting evidence. So let me say first that what has been going on in Europe has been that the reforms that have been done to the pension system have mainly been working on the retirement age. So there are various ways you can reform the pension system and make it more sustainable. One way is indeed to increase the retirement age. Another possibility is to reduce the pension level. And the third approach is to increase the contribution rate. So most countries have taken the first route. And they've taken this first route in a very gradual way. So reforms have a very long phasing in period, so involve a very long transition. During the transition, the risk of reversal is extremely strong. And this, I think, this risk of derailments, of reversal, will be even stronger in the current wave of populism. My preferred definition of populism is a way to underrepresent even more the minorities, and certainly youngsters are a minority in Europe. The voters are people close to the retirement age. So also taking the result of Benjamin's work, these are persons who would be extremely against the increase of the retirement age. When the median voter will become a pensioner, perhaps issues will be better in that respect, but for the time being, this is not the case. So I think we should expect to have a very strong pressure as soon as the steps in the increasing the retirement will take place, to have very strong pressure to postpone this reform or even to dismantle completely, to undo completely this reform. Well, the experience of Italy is particularly revealing in this respect. So what can we do to avoid that this happens? Because clearly that, in a way, would clearly undo most of the effect that we expect from this reform. Certainly, developing complementary pension is very important, is a way to diversify, is a way to invest also in countries that are experiencing higher growth rates than European countries, and that clearly will provide additional income to people that are getting close to retirement, also because this scheme often do allow also for more liquidity access. Second, we should clearly, as much as possible, increase working arrangement that are suitable even in the old age. But the third thing that we should also, I think, take into account is that there will always be people close to retirement age who, because of their human capital, because of the type of job, the stressful job they've been carrying out, they will suffer a lot, the increase in the retirement age. And so there is a lot of heterogeneity really in health and productivity levels for people getting close to the retirement age. And we should somehow take into account of this heterogeneity. So in my view, one way to avoid the reversal of this reform is to allow for some flexible retirement routes that should be sustainable. And it is possible to have more flexibility in retirement age and make it sustainable. The issue is to make the early retirement involving actuarial reduction of the pension levels. So taking the second route, the one of adjusting the levels, taking into account of the residual life expectancy and clearly defining annuities in terms of the age of the retirement. I think had we done something like that in Italy in due time, we would have avoided the current, in a way, reduction in retirement age that was done introducing the so-called quota 100. Reforms of this type that allow people to retire early, but provided that their pension is reduced in a way to make it actuarially neutral, so there is a quite substantial reduction in the pension amount per each year you anticipate you retire before reaching the old pension age. This type of reforms typically involve an increase in pension spending in the short run because there will be more pensioners, but involve substantial savings later on because the pension amounts are lower due to this actuarial reduction. So there should be a way also at the European level when evaluating this reform, to take into account of this intertemporal budget constraint. Often these reforms are not done because indeed they have this immediate effect on pension spending, and this seems to violate fiscal rules. I think fiscal rules should take into account of intertemporal budget constraint and should adopt measures that are being increasingly used in different countries and that we have been using a lot in Italy, also in parliamentary hearing, such as implicit pension debt, that takes into account of this intertemporal structure of the budget of the pension system. It doesn't make any sense, in my view, to reason in terms of static yearly budgets for the pension systems. Second is consideration that I would like to make, if this, let me see if the time I still have. I think I have a few minutes more, concern automatic adjustment. I fully agree with Per that these are extremely important mechanism, and also the recent Italian experience indicates how important they are. In Italy, at the end of 2017, and then in 2018, we had a very strong pressure to phase out the automatic adjustment because beginning of 2019, the old age pension had to be increased by 5 months according to this automatic adjustment. It's not a minor adjustment to take place overnight, basically, from the end of the year to January 1st of 2019. Two parliamentary committees, the two Labour parliamentary commission voted to dismantle the automatic adjustment. Fortunately, the government resisted this attempt, and it was the Gentiloni government, so that's maybe encouraging due to the fact that he's a candidate to become commissioner. And one of the reasons is that the adjustment mechanism was done in such a way that it would have been complicated to do otherwise. There was also an issue of time frame. So a reform had to be done to abolish the automatic adjustment mechanism. It could not be simply that because the adjustment in the year of retirement, the age of retirement, is made by a decree of the Minister of Economy and the Minister of Labor. If they don't issue a decree and the law of automatic adjustment is still there, they are liable. They can be brought to court. So the only way for them not to do the decree was to have a law being passed by the parliament overruling the automatic adjustment, and therefore, in a way, that was extremely was somewhat a way to resist to this very strong pressure. Automatic adjustment are extremely important, and I think perhaps some of the demographic projections may be in terms of the impact of aging on pension spending may sound a bit optimistic, because if you look in the past, we have been having an increase in life expectancy of about 2 years for every decade. So the scenario, I see that the central scenario is 1 year per decade, and that may be, I think, on the low end of what has been going on. Certainly, there may be a slowing down of increasing in life expectancy, but not that the halving of the recent experience of the last 4 decades. Finally, a few considerations on the public-private sector pensions. I think is a very important area to be addressed. Indeed, there are huge asymmetries. In the case of Italy, just to give you some numbers, currently the spending for former civil servants is about 1/3 of the spending for private sector workers, including also the self-employed. So if you take the dependent employees, the ratio will be somewhat different. But certainly civil public sector workers have benefited for several years of favorable pension rules, and that is clearly in the pension spending data. I think that it's very important to go towards an harmonized system, so have the same rules being applied to public sector and private sector workers. This is the reform that was done in Italy since 1996, but again, the transition is relatively long. But to give you an idea of where we are going to go, by 2050, we will go down to having pension spending for public sector workers to be 1/5 of the spending for private sector workers. So the remaining overrepresentation in spending pension for public sector workers will be due to the wage premia of public sector versus private sector workers, and the particular also career profile of public sector workers that is clearly less subject than in the case of private sector workers to unemployment spells. Finally, so this type of reform, the one of harmonizing public sector and private sector workers, would also allow to have a unique administration working on the two very large group of workers. I think that's a development which is very important to be done. This is the way this is the way things are organized currently in Italy, and I think it's something that also in other parts of Europe should be considered. Also because we are going to move soon towards more and more mobile career between public and private sector. This is a feature of recent development in this respect, and therefore I think having a unique administration running both private and public sector workers' pension is important. I think I stop here and may react later on to our questions.
Thank you very much. I would like now to open the floor for question. Everyone who would like to break the ice and ask a question. There is a Giovanni, can you?
Yeah, Stefan Gran, I'm working here for the German Trade Union Confederation, and you can imagine as the trade unions, we never like to increase the pension age. However, there's a question, because you always talk about the dependency rate. And if you talk about dependency rate from retired people to the active population, you can change this dependency on two ways: to decrease the retired people or to increase the activity rate. So if you maybe could be a little bit more focused on how to increase the activity rate, that would be maybe also change something on the dependency ratio. So we can talk about young unemployed to bring more in work. You can talk about women participation in the labor market. You can talk about involuntary part-time. All these are issues you could tackle, and then you would have also an impact on the dependency ratio. And the second is, you took the assumption that the first assumption to increase maybe the contributions or taxes to putting in a system, that would be something that is it's not running well. I wouldn't agree on that, because Fabian Lindner from the IMK, German Institute of Macroeconomics, they just issued a policy brief where they tried to say, if you could increase partly, of course, the contribution if in the German system, and you could take some contribution of the pension system, but it's not really directly linked to the pension, financed by taxes and increasing activity rate. So then you don't have to go really to the enlargement of the retirement age. So there are also other ways possible instead of just increasing the retirement age. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jette. I work for Solidar. I have a question for the panelist regarding the life expectancy, because I hear a lot about this, and I'm personally from a country where the retirement age has been linked to life expectancy. So for me, I am currently expected to retire at age 71 and 3 months. I am wondering how you see healthy life expectancy in all of this, because I doubt maybe for me as a white-collar worker, 71 and 3 months is feasible, but I think for many people it's not feasible to work on such an old age in a healthy way. And I think in this way maybe you don't have an old age dependency ratio, but you create further dependency on the state for people that are simply not able to physically do the work anymore that they used to do. And I wonder what your opinion is on this, and whether healthy life expectancy might be a more useful parameter here.
Maybe another question, otherwise we start to... Who would like to respond to the first comment, basically on alternative ways of approaching the problem, and the second one on life expectancy? Maybe, yeah.
May I briefly start? So on the, I just want to say something to the activity rate. We have a PhD student looking at the Spanish system and asking what happens if you get, for example, more female workers into the Spanish market. Labor force participation of Spanish women is relatively low in Europe. And she actually finds that at least like over 20, 30 years, it doesn't really cure the problem. Why? Because if they work today, they also get a pension in the future. And it just doesn't get you out of the problem that in 30 years or so, there are just not enough people to pay for the people who are currently retired. So yeah, it may be a solution for a couple of years, but in the end, you have to pay also pension to those guys who become now active.
Per?
Yeah, on the dependency ratio and on different versions of it, economic dependency ratios, if you're for info, if you look in the Commission aging reports, we have all the kind of dependency ratios you can think of. So the classic purely population one, old age economic dependency ratio, total economic dependency ratio, which are more relevant. But in general, what you find is that so-called economic dependency ratio, active versus inactive people, they are much higher than the population dependency ratios. And the increase is a little bit lower. So in a way, it's a bit worse starting point if you look at that, but the trends are the same, but the magnitudes are not. And also, it's an important additional aspect, because via those measures, you can assess impacts of improving employment in general in the economy. So that's very important additional aspect. Can I go on the increase taxes? It's true, and I'd like just to recall one thing I showed in one of my slides. Even in the relatively favorable baseline scenario where there is no increase in pension to GDP over the long term, there is in fact an increase over the next couple of decades, and this is due to two factors. First factor is population structure, baby boom retirement, that is kind of happening now and in the coming 1-2 decades. Forward. Backward. And the other aspect is what Tito mentioned, is the phased effect of implemented pension reforms. Many of the reform measures are legislated today, will take effect in 5, in 10, in 15, 20 years' time. So the cost reduction effect will only come very late in the cycle. So even in a baseline scenario, there is still quite a substantive increase in pension expenditure, and this needs to be covered somehow. So of course, you can increase tax and/or social security contribution, and unless you do any more pension reform, or you can issue bonds. And there are issues with both. I heard what you said there about possible policy options discussed in Germany. Generally, the only direction about social security and tax that any policymaker discusses is down, reduce, and especially on labor. So then other forms of revenues is possible, but to my knowledge, it's not very common at all. I remember that, I think, in the Pension Commission in Germany that will give a report next year. I think they did some calculations on what kind of VAT increase would you need if you were to slot it onto that tax base instead of Social Security. And I think the answer was like 7 percentage points rise in the VAT rate. So doesn't sound immediately feasible. But that was just a calculation example, of course, that they did. Last point, if I may, then on life expectancy versus healthy life expectancy. As far as I know, and I think I know pretty well the EU situation, but not so much outside of the EU, no country has a healthy life expectancy link because the indicators are largely missing. All countries that have those kind of links, they have it either on the life expectancy as such or on the contributory period. And this latter can be quite attractive because it can allow for differentials in when you start your career and so on, so you can have an increase in the contributory period. Maybe even better, as also Tito was mentioning, some kind of actuarial system has a lot of advantages for fairness and acceptability among the population. But there are those two kind of aspects. You look at the contributory period and/or life expectancy to take account of one major trend that is almost certain to happen to increase the robustness of the systems. But at the same time, I think if you have a regular pensionable age that is hitting more than 70, sounds a bit science fiction perhaps, but then again, if you think how much life expectancy has increased over the last couple of decades, if you went backward in time 40 years, you would be pretty amazed on where we are today, probably. But an important addition is that one is the regular pensionable age. Almost all countries have some kind of early exit possibility, and that's an important part then for people who have a hard time in coping with the general improvements in life expectancy trends. And this, I think there is no real contradiction, and I think those arrangements will still prevail in the future.
Well, many things have been already said, so just on the dependency ratio, I think there is not much to add. No, on the increasing contribution, I think there are two counterindications. One is the fact that clearly the disemployment effect that it may have. We learn also from research experience that reduction in contribution rates had a very important effect on job creation, particularly among youngsters. If you look around the experience in several countries, including my own country, the impact was very strong. was extremely strong. We got an elasticity to tax reduction that was superior to many expectations. The second problem with increasing contribution rate is that it would crowd out even more complementary pension arrangements that are extremely important for people to diversify, to reduce, because there is a risk associated to investing all our savings for retirement into our own country, like this is what happens typically in pay-as-you-go system, in public pay-as-you-go systems. There is also a political risk because as the system is not sustainable, sooner or later it may be changed. So having a significant portion of savings, of your savings, going to funded schemes, investing globally, is very important. So increasing the contribution to the public may crowd out this additional source of saving. If you look across countries, there is a clear relationship between the size of the private pension assets and the level of the contribution rates. In Italy, there is very small because we have a statutory contribution of the order of 33%. So, but if you increase even more, then I don't think there will be any future for private pension in Italy. And I think everybody would agree, I think, in this room that we need to have mixed pension system working. On the healthy issue, many of the things have already been said by Per. My idea of having some flexibility in retirement is also to take into account of this type of heterogeneity. Another thing that could possibly be done is to take into account of some particularly stressful jobs and jobs that involve a reduction in life expectancy, and there can be actuarial studies and the data we have right now allow us to identify this type of jobs and this type of occupation, to have different pension rules to take into account of that. The fact that we are moving, the changes that are taking place in the structure by occupation of employment in Europe make me thinking that these problems are becoming smaller and smaller over time, but maybe some thought about allowing for some different rules. Some countries already have some rules for stressful jobs. In addition to that, the flexible retirement and sustainable retirement is a way to take into account of this heterogeneity that may arise in the old age. People who are not in a condition to keep on working and could take an early retirement route, provided that they accept that given that they are going to receive their pension for a longer time, their pension level will be lower.
Maybe if I want to pick up on something that was mentioned. If I'm not mistaken, Belgium is the country where the difference between legal retirement age and effective retirement age is among the largest. At least this was the situation until not long ago. Now, what is the driver of lower effective retirement age? Is it the fact that already in reality for certain professions, for certain jobs, it's given the possibility to retire earlier? Or is the fact that sometimes pensions are used as a substitute for unemployment schemes? I think Daniel has also a question.
Yeah, Danny Gross, CEPS. Some of the things which Tito mentioned, others brings for me the question, why do we need a legal retirement age? I mean, as you said, Tito, when we have pre-retirement schemes where you can retire earlier, subject to actuarially adjustments, why should you prevent people from working longer and getting also the actuarially benefit? It seems to me that what the legal pension age does de facto is it creates a high implicit tax on continuing working. I think the OECD had done some measures in the past of the implicit tax rates at certain points in your career. So my question would be twofold. A, is that correct? Is there an increase in the implicit tax rates for people who want to work longer? And B, do you see any possibility that actually we go towards a system that the retirement age is only as a marker for some hypothetical median worker who would then get a hypothetical percentage of replacement rate? but everybody could retire a bit earlier or later. So it would become only a focal point and not an end point, thus diminishing much the tax rates, which I had mentioned earlier.
Maybe start with these two questions and then we go for another round. Who would like to say?
Okay, so on the first question on effective exit age and standard retirement age, legal retirement age, SRA it's called sometimes. But it was much more common in the past because it was early retirement possibilities, either outright early retirement or other pathways out of the labor market. It has been tightened a lot, those conditions. Not that, in a sense, that they are not being used in the mainstream. They are being used only for those categories of people that actually are not able to work. So there is a greater enforcement of the rules, which is common across most countries. Also, it is still ongoing. We did a bit of study on so-called special pensions in the EU in the latest aging report, where we are mapping out all of the schemes that are different from the main social security scheme. And what we found there is that in the EU, certainly, which is what we focused on, is that those schemes are being phased out or in the process of being phased out to a large extent. So generally of having harmonized rules for all types of people in a nation is that's increasingly becoming the norm. I think why to have a legal retirement age? This is a very good question, and I remember a few years ago, Commission did something called a white paper on pension and green paper on pension without having proper formal leverage in this policy area. But one thing that we encountered in our internal consultations is that this is a complex issue. I mean, pension policy, that's one policy. You also have labor market policy. And there is also a statutory retirement age means that the employer can terminate the contract for a reason, for the age. And while in many labor market legislation is such that you cannot dismiss a person unless you have complete loss of profit or severe misconduct and so on. So its pension policy serves an auxiliary purpose of actually being able to terminate employment. This is one aspect. Having said this, there are many countries who have flexible retirement age provisions in place already today. For example, in Sweden and Finland, the bracket when you can retire is flexible between 62 and 67 in the case of Sweden. So you choose. In that particular country, you cannot. They will pass a reform next year to take away that restriction. But I think it is this. The auxiliary reasons for pension legislation is then that it enables employer to terminate the contract. It could be done with different policies, but it's not always done with different policies. So the pension policy is the one that is actually used to achieve that potential problem. But another example is the United Kingdom, where you can work while still drawing your pension. So there is no restrictions. There is no statutory retirement age anymore in the UK. It's only a pensionable age, allowing you to draw a pension and to do either work or not. So there are flexible arrangements there too.
So now with Brexit, we cannot go anymore to work to London after 67.
Well, I thought it was Italy the champion in the difference between legal and effective retirement age, which in Italy is about 5 years, so quite a large one. Yeah, I agree with Per. It's largely is a legacy of these different rules that were applying. So harmonization is a way to undo part of this, but not entirely, because another very important component of this is related to seniority. So there are seniority schemes, and the typical approach to retirement is people saying, okay, well, I've been working for 40 years. I just want to retire. I just want to focus on my family. So there are ad hoc rules for people having a long seniority. So I think that the way to handle the seniority issue is the same as the one was suggested before. So having some flexibility in retirement. These are persons who indeed may decide at some stage of their life that they've been enough of working, and they, given that they've been working so much, have been accumulating a quite significant pension, and they can really do something else in their life, take care of their family, of their grandchildren, or whatever. And this is something that we should accept as a possibility, provided that these people, given that they are going to receive a pension for a longer time, they receive a lower pension. So the idea of the flexibility in retirement with actuarial reduction is also to allow to dismantle these seniority schemes, and in that case make not create a privileged status for some categories of people, having the same rules for everybody. Now, this will never bring us to a situation where you can allow full flexibility in terms of retirement age, because otherwise you would violate the whole idea of having a public pension system, so the paternalism. Clearly, you want to make sure that people accumulate enough savings for their old age. That's the principle behind the build-up of a public pension system. You may perhaps impose that there is a minimum level of a pension where you are allowed to take into account of this. Indeed, in the proposal that we developed as Social Security for the Italian case, we had put that you had to have at least 3 times the minimum pension in order to exploit this flexibility, so this flexibility retirement options. So if you put this type of limits, then you can allow for more freedom to workers. Another problem in allowing full freedom also at lower ages is that there is also a demand component behind retirement, and workers in low bargaining position may be forced sometimes to retire, and that's something that one should take into account before fully liberalizing the pension age. This being said, I think what Daniel was saying about not having this incentive for people to work longer is instead very important. So one may think about having not only actuarial reduction for those retiring below the normal age of retirement, but we also may have actuarial increase for people working longer. Another thing that, however, it's already currently possible in most countries is that you can cumulate pensions and work. You cannot do that often when you retire before the normal retirement age, but in most countries, if you retire after reaching the normal retirement age, you can also combine earnings and you have to quit the current job you have, but you can still go on working. There are reasons why there are mandatory retirement schemes in some countries, and the reason why you put sometimes the limit is that typically you have a wage tenure profile that are increasing, and at the same time productivity at the old age tend to go down, and therefore it's done to protect the employer, this type of arrangement. So there is clearly quite a large gap that in the old age you get between the wage you get and your productivity. So it's done for the benefit of the employer to have a mandatory retirement at some point. I think this issue is less relevant today, and most countries do not have that type of rules. So in a way, it would make sense, in my view, to have some possibility to work even beyond the normal retirement age under this circumstance.
Thanks, Andreas Backhaus from CEPS. We have done a bit of research here that suggests that, for example, the decision to retire is often made in a intergenerational context, meaning, for example, older age workers retire, particularly women, to provide care for their grandchildren. So I've been wondering, is there any evidence on the support for retirement and pension reforms that takes this intergenerational perspective into account? For example, do young people think different about retirement reforms conditional on whether they have parents that they want to retire, for example, to free up their time for childcare, or do they see, well, my parents will not be able to live on their pension, so they will be financially dependent on me? Is there any evidence in this direction already going on? Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Maxime Charity. I'm Social Affairs Director in Business Europe. Thanks a lot for the very useful presentations. I have a question to all panelists. What is your view on the effectiveness of reforms through concrete examples? What has been for you the most effective ways of reforming pensions in a concrete country? And are there good trends globally that you think could inspire Europe as well?
Any other further question? I think we just close with these two. Who would like to say something?
So perhaps concerning the intergenerational effects of retirement, so that is certainly a big issue, so that it's a household decision often, so when to retire and who's retiring, and there's a lot of research going on this, I guess. So in my case, that was single persons asked, so that we couldn't differentiate between whether it was a household decision or an individual decision. So the best reform, I would actually say, it's really increasing the legal retirement age. So coming back to the other question with increasing taxes or contributions, I mean, we are gaining 2 years of life expectancies every decade. So I would say that is really a margin where we can do something, and that is not coming at economic costs like increasing taxes or increasing contribution rates. So yeah.
So regarding the second question, and maybe some thoughts I had to earlier comments that go also in that direction. My experience from Germany is they did 2 types of reforms, as Per told us. So there was the increase in retirement age phased in, and there was this automatic adjustment factor. Somehow the political process seemed to have worked that they haven't really reversed the retirement age thing. There seems to be not really the political support for it, but this adjustment factor seems to be very easy to say every year, well, this year we don't do it. So that seems to have been a reform that is much easier to be reversed. So you don't reverse the entire reform, but you say every year, well, this year we don't. And I was wondering whether you know whether something else, whether something similar was also going on in other countries. And then what Tito just said about the, you want to have a fixed legal retirement age kind of to protect the employer. I understand that argument, but what I don't understand is why don't we still allow the option for the employer and the employee both to say, look, in this particular match, there is still a surplus. Why can we not continue? So at least that kind of flexibility seems to be kind of common sense for me. And then given what I would talked about, the harmonization of systems, I think there's just no good reason at all to have a separate system for public and private retirees. I don't see any economic reason for having that, so I think it's kind of an obvious point that you want to harmonize them, also to possibly save administrative costs, something I didn't talk about today.
Very quickly on the support for pension reforms and so the age profile of the support. One thing that we always have to take into account is that there are widespread misperception of the work of a public pension system. The 2 dominant views are one of a bank deposit, so basically is a piggy bank where you just put the money and you can draw the money out of this whenever you can, when I was president of INSA, I was getting every single day letters of people saying, I've been putting so much money, why don't you allow me to take it out? Or the other example is a contractual arrangement between you and your employer, something that is due at the end of your career. That, again, there is no idea of intergenerational pact, of the fact that current workers are paying for a current pension. And that's a serious problem also from the standpoint of the political support of young people for the pension reforms. The best reform, in my view, I think, is the introduction of an NDC system. The NDC system is proving to perform rather well. It allows for cohort-specific, in a way, balance, and it mimics a funded scheme. People understand better the work of a system. It is good from a standpoint of incentive to contribute, especially in countries with where there is quite a sizable informal sector. I think and clearly it has to have this automatic adjustment, but the international experience seems to me to be rather promising. I know there have been a number of surveys of NDC across the world, and they seem to be so I'm not only biased by the Italian experience. I think in also other countries has been rather good. Finally, on the mandatory thing, I was saying that this was introduced in a context where pay was seniority based, and there was this decline in productivity. Now, pay, especially in the private sector, is no longer so much seniority based. And we get also relatively high levels of productivity even in the old age. And we get this tremendous heterogeneity, exactly what you were saying before. So I agree with you. You don't need to force people. In a way, this institution was not so important because the incentives were, so was not biting in a way, because the incentives were so strong to retire as soon as possible that there was no need to have a mandatory retirement in several countries. If you make the thing neutral, I think that's the way to handle this, and in general, the problem of this gap between pay and is going to disappear. So I'm not particularly. I was just providing the rationale for this institution to be in place, and the move toward a flexible retirement age, perhaps having these actuarial increases later on is a way to handle.
On good examples with reforms, I'd like to add another dimension on this, and that is the dimension of stability of reforms. Because if you do a pension reform, it's a kind of a social contract that typically is supposed to be in place for long times. So if you do a reform that is well analyzed, well sanctioned, and well anchored with the target population, with the voters, social partners, stakeholders, and so on, that's also something that is quite valid, instead of having so-called August parliamentary recession reforms that sometimes happen. Then you pass a new pension law. So this kind of stability argument is an interesting one, and I think there are two examples come to mind. One is the reform in Sweden, which incidentally, as Tito mentioned, happened to be one of those NDC-type pension system, which analytically, I find it to be quite neat, the NDC reform. I have to immediately say that the Commission sees merit in all pension arrangements. It's country-specific, and you can make all pension systems good, but you need to calibrate them very well. Denmark is another example where there's lots of stability. They set up something called the Welfare Commission in the 90s. They did a lot of studies. They did a lot of consultation with everybody. And there has been very little reform since they actually did it. Another example, partly, is the one of the Netherlands, although that's a bit more complex because discussion is still ongoing because of their key ingredient of having large occupational funds, which is something that is atypical in EU context. But at least when it comes to their state pension, they did things quite neatly, I think, in that they consulted with everybody, with the population, information campaigns, asking people, If life expectancy increases, do you find it reasonable that you should work a little bit longer? So a lot of, say, sanctioning of the rationales for the policy measures. So those are, say, some good examples, but at the same time, it's clear that countries come from very, very different situations. I mean, just look at the fiscal data, for example. So the range of pension spending to GDP in the EU is between 7% of GDP in a few countries in the north, in the Baltics, up to 17, 18% of GDP in more southernmost countries. So this spread is mind-blowing almost. So this then shows that the public pension system fulfills very different functions in different member states. And again, this is not something you can just totally change from one year to the next or from one mandate period to the other. There should be some long-term stability in those arrangements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there was no better way to close than the successful examples and best examples of pension reforms. Many thanks to this excellent set of speakers. Many thanks to the audience for coming, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Yes, and his people. Marco Cacchiotti is a new head of unit, who is the concrete member of the technical working group. And this review is going to take place in November.